And we've got so much data now and so much good technology to use to help people use their space more effectively. So to your point around, around COVID, if you had sensors on your desk that said this desk's been cleaned and is available, then you could book that desk, but you're not going to sit at that same desk again the next day, probably because actually the next day you might work from home or you might be with a client, for example. So keeping that flow is important, but I also think moving forwards, that data will start to shape how these occupiers in the future occupy their space. How much space they need, where they need to put the desks, whether they have a collaborative zone and is it being used, how many meeting rooms do they have. All that stuff should become part of how occupiers in the future use their office, because it's going to be far more effective for them from a space management and a cost point of view.
Yeah, completely.
Do you think they will?
Sorry, Mark, go ahead.
Do you think that'll ever transfer onto the flexible workspace owners for the responsibility to put the means and the ability to collect that data in as part of the offering, so they can move into that fully data collection office, ready to go? Will that ever become a responsibility of the flexible workspace provider?
It should. The tech's there, and it's not, it's not massively expensive to get these sensors in, and there's obviously the meeting room equipment, which a lot of them have anyway, but absolutely should become part of what they deliver, because it gives them so much good information about their tenants. So they can go to their tenants, say you've got a tenant in who's got 100 desks, you can speak to them on renewal and say, looking at the data in your office, you've got 50% occupancy. So why don't you take a smaller office? And all that stuff will help them retain those tenants going forward. And also just help them in terms of how they fit out their flex buildings in the future, because they know exactly how their tenants want to occupy them. So it's definitely something they think about.
In terms of how the providers or landlords market their space, this is actually more important than ever. So historically, when the provider or the landlord would spend money on a glossy marketing brochure or some kind of PR spin, that's gone way down on people's lists. Actually, people, and we've seen this across the board with different providers actually, in terms of what they're actually doing within buildings. And so far as even over the last week, I've been into various co-working buildings in central London, and I've been amazed actually in the scale of what different companies are doing. And so far as all of them have the tracks on the floor to let us know where we're walking and social distance desks, but others have already gone steps further, and so far as processes of been able to open the doors without touching them, taking away the iPads, and these are going to be the things which are really important to the occupiers. So if it's my company, I want to be able to say to my staff, you guys are really safe because this is what the provider's doing for us. This is the data. This is knowing that we're in a good place here. Whereas actually, if you're going into the building and you're having to type your key code in to go in, and you're going to have to open the door, then you're walking through, then you're going to the shared, if I'm a tenant, I'm not liking that. I'm saying to my boss, I don't want to be here. So it will really help sell the buildings.
And then, there's a couple of things with that as well, isn't there?
Sorry, Vic.
I was just going to say, there's a couple of things with that, isn't there? I had a conversation recently around, we've been asked for a brief on how to look for a new building with coronavirus considerations. So it's now the point of, traditionally we were looking at business continuity sites that were supportive of terrorism or security breaches or bomb scares, and now we're looking at something that's like an invisible killer or a pandemic, where the shift on business continuity has changed. So to Harry's point, there are lots of these things that are taking place in terms of markings on floors and making sure that there is potential guarding on doors. There's one designated person to open some doors or stair circulation through the buildings. One of our clients has got temperature checks on all of the reception entrance doors. But it sort of comes down to Mark's point, in terms of the future, if it's a development or if it's a landlord building for a tenant, there's going to almost need to be a suite of considerations that are now thought of for this pandemic. And I don't know why it wasn't really considered when we had the SARS outbreak, because that was as big an outbreak, if not bigger. Don't quote me on that, I'm not sure on stats. And I don't think our offices and our environments ever caught up at that point. So this is really going to be a game changer in terms of smart building techniques and the smart building operations and the built-in infrastructure networks. Mark and Robin, the conversations we've been having around BIM and what that could probably do to help support these types of conversations. So it's almost like this checklist is starting to be built, but we don't know how big that checklist is going to have to be.
And ultimately, there's cost savings, right?
Yeah.
You could get very granular with that, and you've just described some of those things. I had a conversation with a tenant last week, and we're looking for a flexible solution, and we actually raised the point of corridors and a circular corridor setup, so that there could potentially be a one-way traffic round the whole floor was seen as beneficial to just having a central corridor. So it's going to be really interesting going forward what different people are going to be prioritizing. But the point you're making, developers and landlords really need to be thinking in that granular detail potentially when they're putting together their buildings and designing their offering.
Not every small company that takes up office space is going to have the capability in house to do it. It's all very good thinking that a workplace specialist or a big industry player, they will have likely teams and capability to be able to record this data, and a lot of them already will be. But it's companies the size and shape that are moving into shared office buildings and maybe taking up a portion of a floor. We can't assume that all these are going to be pro data collectors in terms of their workplace already. So in terms of adding a string to their own bow of the landlords, it's increasing their service offerings, it's increasing their package, it's delivering value.
Yeah.
I think unfortunately what you might find is some landlords will have to, I guess, learn the hard way a little bit, the same as like increasingly. So in the city fringe, where I kind of specialize in, what we've found over the last few years is landlords fitting out the offices for tenants and furnishing the offices. That's now the new normal, the same as like putting air conditioning into a space. And for a long time, many landlords were like, I don't want to do this. I'm not going to do this. That's a tenant's job. And then they wondered why their spaces remained empty for 6 to 12 months. And yet the landlord next door who'd done these things to the tenants, actually got the spaces let straight away, and he didn't have those void costs. And it could be a little bit like here, where actually some in the city fringe, it's a good mix now, because historically where it's more smaller private landlords, because those areas like Clerkenwell and Shoreditch are now really popular with tech and creatives, you are finding, some of the bigger landlords, the property companies, the funds have invested heavily. So I think they will hopefully, because they have, I guess, the means to do so, they will hopefully drag the rest of the market up with them. But you find, in the fringe market, people like Derwent London own a lot of buildings, and as landlords go, they are, up there as the top of their game when it looks at these kind of elements. So I think, people will see what they're doing, and they will follow, because they'll have to ultimately get their spaces let.
Difficulties at the moment is people are not having the time to think about these future considerations, and I think it's a huge issue. I personally believe in the sense of everyone's being extremely reactive and trying to support the now and trying to support the requirements. So every piece of learning that's coming through, like I need to return to office, I've got 5 kids at home, I can't concentrate, this is not an ideal, all the way through to well, there's no way I'm going to that building, so I've got to go 40 floors up and take a lift, which could have 6 other people in there, so I'm not going back to work. Every type of learning that's coming through is reacted, and then all of a sudden we get flooded. And I don't know if you guys are finding it, but we find it in our industry where we're flooded with people that do a similar type of role to us and are saying, this has got to do this. And that's not the case. At the moment, we're all sort of planning for the considerations and mapping out the future, and not many of our clients have got the time to sit and wait for that, and they're responding very quickly. So, to a lot of our clients, there might be some initial quite vast spend that's being done, but both on resource time and in physical investments for sanitizing stations or barriers and things like that, that actually in the long run could be not the right thing to do, but they have to make those spaces safe for the return.